So that is a context. That is the world that people operate in. In comparison, characterization is maybe in this case, the choices of women are affected by the patriarchy, right? So perhaps one is they have a tendency to doubt themselves. They don't know if they're good enough, even if they are very, very qualified. They tend to self-select themselves out of applying for certain positions because they doubt themselves far more than a straight male with less skills but more confidence because of the world favoring men in the first place, right? Or maybe secondly, they disproportionately feel unsafe. So maybe walking the streets alone is something that they will always feel unsafe with in comparison to a man who might not feel the same way. So as you can see, the difference here is one is a general framework, one is a kind of the facts and the problems, but characterization kind of explains what people do within that, right? How are they affected by the context that you give? The next example is also, next slide, please. Something that I think you guys might find very useful in debates in general, which is about crime. So context perhaps can be that crime is a rampant problem and is most evident in underprivileged areas. But characterization is a bit more nuanced. That one, many people turn to crime out of economic desperation. So I'm characterizing the kinds of people who do these crimes, or the kinds of people who contribute to this endemic problem that is criminal activity. And that's where you can also maybe clarify the cyclical nature of crime and poverty. That for many people, because they come from underprivileged, low-income backgrounds, they get hungry, they get desperate, they can't afford the things that they need. So they end up choosing to do things like economic crime, so stealing, etc. If they get caught, they go to jail. And because they're in jail, that's time taken away from education, and that's also a strike in their record that makes it harder for them to find jobs. And so they can only turn to, for example, low-skilled labor, or labor that tends to not be as prejudiced against people who used to be in jail. And therefore, they get low income, and then it goes back to the cycle of hunger and economic crime, etc. Or you can even expand it and say that when you are low income and you are later in life and you have a child, the kid has insufficient education, and that cycle is not just within you and your life, but generational. So this is like, again, a clear characterization of how people are affected by stimuli. But maybe a person naturally is not a bad person. A person naturally does not want to do crime. But because of the externalities explained in this, that characterizes why they opt into these kinds of things. So that's a clear distinction between contextualization and characterization. So before we go on to the rest of the lecture, do you guys have any questions specifically about like the definitions of the two and the distinction? No naman. Okay, sige. So you can still send it. I'll see it naman. Sorry, just let me know if I'm talking too fast, if you need me to be like slow down my pace. So why are these things important to know? And I think like people kind of undercut the value of characterization, but they're very, very important because they serve as the fundamental basis of the rest of your strategic case. Deciding on your team strategy, like who do you want to protect in your team case? Are you going to focus on the poor? Are you going to focus on women? Are you going to focus on intersectional women, etc.? Problem solution identification. So there's always this thing thrown around that there's a problem solution mismatch. And because debate is oftentimes about solving problems, you want to make sure that you are clear about the problem you're trying to solve so you can link back your solution in a way that is realistic. Next, benefits and harms, and finally, priorities and weighing. The last two, I think, are things you'll kind of learn also in framing, etc. But this just serves as a basis for you to start doing the rest very well. And so as long as you have this, it'll be far easier to do the rest of it very instinctively without having to think too hard. So next slide, please. Just to synthesize this, contextualization is environment. You use it for problem identification, for a policy resource debate, versus characterization that is more about people and nature. Likelihood. How likely is this going to happen? How likely are people going to act in the way that you want them to act? Benefits and harms. Based on the lived reality and choices that people make, how are they affected? How are they benefited or harmed? And it analyzes the stimuli. So whether that be the change the policy wants to make, or the narratives that already prevail, or also the resistance to change for people. How willing are they to change their minds? And those are all fundamentals of framing. So the next lecture, which is Kyle's lecture, will focus more on framing. I'll touch on it a little bit, but it's more on this. So next slide, please. Note that people do this all the time. I'm sure you guys know how to do this and you guys do this all the time. What you need to practice is doing it with intent and purpose. So knowing specifically that you're putting this in and questioning how to utilize it, especially in referring back to your weighing and your impacting, etc. And this is a fundamental improving likelihoods, impacting, and high-level weighing. So while it seems very simple and intuitive, being able to do it well and specifically elevates your debating to make it easier to weigh or impact even if you don't have time to really prep how to weigh it. So how do you then contextualize and characterize here? So let's start with the pre-round to-do list. These are 4 things you kind of need to do before you even walk into a tournament. 1, build a body of knowledge. Watch rounds and, in my opinion, take notes on the rounds you're watching. Listen to your opponents. Take notes if you think they're better. If you do an open and you hit like, I don't know, a world champion, just take notes on their speech, even if you know you're getting thrashed, right? Read the news, listen to podcasts. Building that body of knowledge makes it easier for you to pick and choose historical examples of why people acted in the way that they acted. So whether it be maybe why the suffragettes became the suffragettes in the first place, or why people were so enraged by the death of George Floyd that they chose to start protesting in the streets and start BLM, or even just like, obviously with more matter heavy things, why things turned out the way that they did. So building that body of knowledge allows you to pick and choose the contexts and characterizations you will use in every round. Second is have empathy. And I would say this is what I turn to because I'm not the kind of person who enjoys math loading. And it's just putting yourself in the shoes of other people or even drawing from your own experience. So for example, in the PSDC, this house regrets the decline of early long-term relationships in the youth. Maybe not all of you here have had relationships. Maybe most of you guys can't really like matter load on relationships very easily. Maybe you can draw from your experiences in reading books or watching drama TikToks, or even just imagining what your friends went through when they had it, right? So having that empathy and having that practice of thinking about how real people are affected will help you at least be more specific about your characterization. Third is use your common sense. So sometimes it's just a matter of like, okay, um, women experience a wage gap. Why is that bad? Well, if you don't have money, you can't do the things that you want. Maybe you want to move to Manila from the province. Maybe you want to buy the clothes that you want. Maybe whatever it is, right? Maybe you want to just be able to buy a house for your family. All of these things naturally are things you cannot do without money. And it's just unfair if they don't get the money that they deserve for the job that they did. So just using common sense oftentimes solves a lot of the problem of definitional and characterization debates. Finally, remember that debates are usually about real people. So you want to be realistic. You want to make sure that what you are saying is the likely way in which people will act, truly reflect perhaps the way that people do act in real life. And humanizing them allows you to have a more strong vibey debate as well. So even if you aren't the most mechanistically strong, just showing to the judge that these are real people you care about can oftentimes win you on the vibe or win you on explaining the vulnerabilities of people. So baking this into the setup then. Where is it? Okay, there. Sorry, my laptop is a bit laggy. So baking this into the setup, there are 2 things you need to remember. One is clear problem identification. Why is this a big problem right now? How does it affect people? And why does it exist or why hasn't it been solved? So maybe also consider alternatives. This part is important because while it might not come exactly word for word per question in a PM speech, having this in your heads in prep will make you guys very clear in your strategy. Because if you explain to the judge, even in PM, that X problem is the biggest problem in this debate and is the biggest barrier to, for example, women getting the empowerment that they need, you already, by contextualizing and characterizing that, kind of preemptively frame out any other problem that maybe opposition might say is the real problem in this debate. And that way, if it's really about empowering women on either side, you are far more clear about what you want to do. And it just serves as a strong framework so you and your teammate don't go too wacky on ideas. Second, setting the conditions that people are subject to. So what norms, trends, or narratives prevail that perpetuate this? Who imposes them? How changeable are these conditions? So for example, with again the same example of patriarchy and with women and feminism, what kind of norms and trends exist? Maybe it's things like beauty standards that impose that women need to care about how they look much more than men do. Maybe it's the idea or the stereotype of women being the caretakers, that them being aggressive means that they're, am I allowed to curse? That they're a bad person. So these kinds of things just clarify to you and to the judge what you're really dealing with in this debate, and actually helps to make your analysis more refined. Because if you notice, debate is really just the same arguments said over and over again in different flavors. And this is how you make it really pop. This is like the salt and pepper or the basil and thyme to really make your arguments more spicy, even if you've used them 100 other times before. So next on strategic setup policy making, then. So first is after problem identification, you want to ask what features of this world can be changed and how, and why haven't alternatives worked before? Secondly, you want to ask what are things that would be well received by the public or done well by the government slash actor. And that's where one, you need to consider how op would clash with your policy, but that's how you start questioning what are people's priorities. So one way of illustrating this is, for example, voter priorities. So maybe every single person has very many different identities that they can identify with. So I am an upper middle class woman from the Visayas, from Cebu, right? And what that means is that there are many different ways in which my voter behavior might act. Maybe I, as a person, might prioritize someone who is more, I guess, economically protectionist because I come from a position that already benefits off the current system. Or maybe I want someone who is more pro Bisaya, pro regions, right? Because I feel like maybe I've been, or my province has been forgotten by the capital or by Imperial Manila. Maybe I want to vote based on who I think is the best representative of me as a woman, right? Looking for a woman role model, or at least looking for someone who is progressive enough to care about reproductive health rights. So that is the first step, right? Analyzing that actor in these ways, but also being more specific about, based on those three things, what might be their main priority. Is it their position in society based on their gender and empowering them as a woman? Is it their position in society based on their geographic location, me wanting to be empowered as like someone from a province? Or is it my priority of keeping my economic status? And this is where you have a bit more weighing and characterization. There are many common characterizations that people use and that you guys can also use. Like, for example, one, in defending economic status, you could say that's a prerequisite to accessing any other benefit. Two, in defending perhaps like feminism and gender, etc. It can be that regardless of how much material gain I have, it is my perception of safety that matters and therefore determines my quality of life. Or three, maybe it's like the idea that because I cannot separate from my identity as someone from this region, or because I am unlikely to want to leave that region, that is the framework I'm confined to. And the only way for me to change that is to vote in favor of that kind of change. So that kind of strategic, like that kind of thinking helps a bit more in explaining how the public or how the people who are affected by this policy would receive it. So there are many ways to justify it. So it's about weighing it then. And that's what's really important in strategic setup, where it's not just listing characterizations willy-nilly, but having a very intentional way of explaining why one must supersede the other, and therefore explains the general behaviors of the public or the most important actor for your side. And yes, of course, again, consider how op would clash with your policy, because sometimes strategic setup and characterization just preempts and outframes some arguments that might come from opposition. So by the end of setup, you want one, it should be clear what your team's priority and strategy is, and whether that's explicitly said in your speech or at least implicitly or explicitly determined only in prep, you want that to be clear. But two, the world in which your arguments operate in should be established. So there's also always that question of, should we set this in the developing or developed world? That has to be clear by the end of your setup. And that also comes from the practice of thinking about how affected either world would be with this policy and explaining why one might be more important than the other. Next, narrowing or expanding the debate. This relies on framing, and that will be discussed in the next lecture from KL. But this relies on an acute understanding of the context and actors. So, for example, in the PSTC motion, this House regrets the decline of early long-term relationships among the youth. If you want to expand the debate, you can talk about how it's not just about people who would opt in or opt out of these relationships, but you can expand it more by saying that it affects the narratives that all of them will go through, even if this person would not have opted into a relationship in either world. And so you can do this by characterizing, by saying that the youth live very social centric lives. They share stories, they care about how other people perceive them, they have cuento sessions with their friends, right? And so opting into long-term relationships often affect the narratives promoted among the youth with each other. So the kind of content you would see in social media is shifting. The kind of life advice or love advice you would see would shift. The kind of way that they would assess maybe a good partner later on or a good way to live your love life is affected by this decline culturally because of the way that young people live. So what this does is it expands the debate that it's not just about the opt-in or opt-out of people who would or would not have gone into these long-term relationships, but just broadly how the decline has larger implications to the rest of society. And it's only explained clearly by explaining why the youth are likely to have this specific decline affect narratives overall. And you can use this on the flip side to disprove other behaviors too. And you can kind of just like link it back. So do you guys have any questions on this section specifically? Okay, none so far. Sige. So let's go on then to baking it into an argument. And I want to note that it's actually a lot less complicated than people think. And I think many of you guys actually do it already. So one, if your argument relies on X actor doing Y thing, you should characterize that at the premise or at the top of your analysis. So normally what I like to do in this regard is like, I'll be like, first argument is this. Before I go to analysis, I want to frame or I want to note that people often act in X way because of Y thing. But I'd also like to note that many arguments require you to characterize as you build. So some of these behaviors or some of these practices that I want you guys to use must be done consciously all throughout prep. So let's do this by example, because I think that's the best way to show it. So let's look at the motion, this House would abolish the prison system. And the context here, just very broadly, we won't go too specific, is like prisons have very terrible conditions for inmates. Police brutality is very rampant, and it's hard to correct because of strong narratives among policemen that they ought to crack down on crime or that criminals deserve the kind of abuse that they are getting in these prisons. There's also a fear factor that many prison guards experience, which make them turn to violence first, because in their heads, the people who they are guarding are people who are capable of inflicting harm. So this is the context, and it's a general framework to explain what the prison system kind of looks like, right? So it's not too specific, but it does kind of explain the harms that exist there. Next slide, please. So let's say that the argument on Gov is prisons are inherently immoral conditions. So it's like a bit more principled. And I'm picking this because I want to show you guys how characterization can really help. And I would say that while it helps in either principled and pragmatic arguments, they often help the most in principled ones, in my opinion. So let's characterize prisoners, right? Number one, the vast majority of them are in for petty or economic crimes. And so this is where we're trying to clarify or narrow down the debate to where most people fall. So it's not really about murderers. It's not really about people who have done like very, very violent things, because most of these people are people who do economic crimes. So why do they do this? It's because they're often desperate. It's very difficult for them to make informed decisions because of the desperation. One, because of extreme physical responses. When you are hungry, you will turn to being more like when you are hungry, you will probably become more and more desperate to do things that you would not have otherwise done because it is a matter of survival. That's an instinct that you have. And second, it's just the lack of alternatives. Many of these, as we discussed earlier in the cycle of poverty, don't have many other options, right? Many of them are denied economic opportunity. Oftentimes, they are not given jobs by society. They are not trusted. So what happens is they're pushed to this extreme where they have to do these kinds of things, right? And then insert the rest of the analysis here. And so next slide, please. So what you would explain, right, is that oftentimes because of that, they're harmed by a society which pushes them to do crime, and then society punishes them further by putting them into the prison system, as we already explained in the context, is very abusive and tends to harm the people on the ground in a way that is hard to reverse. So that's how you can weaponize the context to explain that you're basically trapping people in these instances, and why their specific characterization means that in principle it's bad. So note that I'm using very specific, clear, and visceral language. Like, it's not enough to stop at the first level of saying people are desperate. You need to explain why and what that looks like. So let's continue the argument. We link it to the policy. By abolishing the prison system, you don't doubly punish them anymore. Because if the prison system is unchangeable, as you've explained, what we are doing is making sure they're not put in an abusive system. Probably the comparative is like you put them in rehabilitation centers, we determine when they're ready to get released, etc., etc. And then you can have pragmatic implications. So it's basically, you have a principled argument that concludes to say that we ensure justice by making sure they're not doubly punished. But secondly, we can have like a pragmatic impact part, where one, you reduce disillusionment from the state and therefore get more cooperation. And you link it back again to the characterization of these people, that they're often poor, or they often turn to these crimes because of state failure. The failure for the state to give them the needs that they deserve, and that the needs that they ought to have by virtue of their rights and by virtue of them having to survive as people. And that is where they trust in the state less, and they're willing to break the laws of the land and break the promise that they made with the state by doing crime. So by making sure that they're not harmed further, you reduce their lack of trust in the state, and they're probably more willing to cooperate. They're probably more willing to trust government systems because they're not being harmed doubly. And second, you can say that there's just less harm to the most vulnerable. And you can just say, note that all the characterization we explain about prisoners actually also explain why they're very, very vulnerable people, because it's a cycle that is very hard for them to break out of. What this therefore means is, if they are the people with no alternatives, they are the most important people we need to prioritize. We cannot change the prison system. It is very difficult to change the circumstances that they have right now. And the least we can do, therefore, is make sure that in the process of rehabilitation, in the process of upholding justice, we do not abuse them further. So, at every step of this argument, more or less, I'm just trying to I just keep trying to tie it back to the characterizations, to the context that I explained, to really show why harm exists and why people are inherently limited by the hand that is dealt by them. So do you guys have any questions about this example or any clarification on that at all? Okay, I'll just let it cook for a bit while I continue. So next slide, please. Oh, wait, I double inputted pala there. So tips to synthesize. One, take a reasonable but urgent context to prioritize. So the baseline of your case is always the context you want to address. So you want to make sure that it's not something that op will be like, no, you're wrong, that's stupid. You have to make sure it's something that they can't really deny, or at least that a judge will reasonably believe, even if you don't justify it too much. Second is be clear and visceral in characterizing actors. So again, it's very different to say that they are desperate versus to say that they have low economic opportunities, they are hungry, and there is a clear cycle of poverty that exists that is hard for them to break out of. Those two things have very, very different vibes. So even if you would say the main idea is there, it is the extent of detail that changes the perception of your argument to be more analytically rigorous, or at least more important, because it's very clear what that desperation looks like. Finally, always link back to the problem that you identified, because that is, again, your strategy to winning. If you're able to prove that this problem that you explain exists will be solved by this policy, that is how you win this debate. Next, contextualizing and closing. So let's first start with how to contextualize at closing. It's actually only one slide, and honestly, there's not much to say about this other than to say that it's broadly the same strategy as in making extensions. Look for the gap in opening. So explain in detail why a specific group or demographic forgotten in the opening exchange is the most vulnerable. So it's the same strategy with extensions where you kind of just have to look at who they forgot or who they're not clearly explaining or defending. And then you can just go into more detail. You can talk about the extent of vulnerability. So like what I explained earlier, that it's hard for them to just break out of that cycle. You can talk about the scale of numbers, which is also explained here, where I said the vast majority of these prisoners are people who do this out of poverty. You can talk about access to alternatives, which is also kind of baked into the analysis and characterization mentioned earlier, or you can talk about the depth of the harm. So it's not explained in this example specifically, but an example of depth of harm is when you talk about like the more emotional debates, where it's like about love, you can talk about why the depth of harm is not just one person being harmed once, but one person being harmed and every single choice they make for the rest of their life being shaped by the trauma. So as you can see, I'm like characterizing the trauma, but it's also a way to frame that harm to be very, very big and very large. So in contextualizing and closing, there's nothing specific I can say other than just like in everything else, look for gaps. Two, be very detail specific. And three, I guess it's not put in the slide, but what's also important is if you're taking a different characterization or a different context, you have to explain why it is the most important. And that happens with weighing. So it's the things here mentioned, extent of vulnerability, etc., etc. And there are some lectures from the DEP series that will also help you with this. So again, it's very hard to be very specific because we don't have a lot of time and it's very interdisciplinary in nature, but contextualizing and closing broadly relies on these things. Next, proving your context and characterization. And I want to stress this, as much as possible, you shouldn't have to prove it. You have to pick things that are very intuitive. So next slide, please. The best contexts and characterizations are grounded on reality because you want to spend more time proving your argument, mechanizing the policy, and not like quibbling about characterizations and contexts. So you want to be very grounded on reality in picking the things that you were pushing. But if it fails, it still comes down to framing and weighing. So maybe you guys don't agree on whether or not this debate exists in developing or developed countries. But what you can do in DEP-IT or in WHIP or in the last part of your first speaker speech is to explain why that frame is the most important. There are some like general pieces of framing that you can use and then just adapt emotions. So for example, the idea that the developing country context is the most important context because these are the countries that are entrenched in poverty, that experience like economic disparity, not just within their borders, but between other countries internationally, right? Or maybe if you're talking about developed countries, you could talk about why a lot of the development and strengths that they have naturally trickle down to the developing world. So you have to preserve them first to be able to have all the other benefits accrue and spread out. So as much as possible, contextualize and characterize in a way that is naturally and intuitively believable and grounded on reality because while debate kind of runs wacky arguments sometimes, is very much grounded on real people and real things. So I'm gonna do one last example just to kind of help drive this down a little bit. Sorry, it's a very long motion, but it's one I did recently and I quite enjoyed it because it was very characterization heavy. So I'll read it out. For nations that have gone through collective trauma, for example, genocide, colonization, civil war, etc., this house prefers narratives that emphasize cultural elements removed from a trauma. So, regional festivals, shared language, emphasis on looking on the future, over narratives that memorialize the trauma, memorials, minority quota policies, etc. So let's look at this in the lens of OP. Next slide, please. And on OP, where you kind of defend memorializing trauma and then you don't prefer pushing language and like regional festivals, etc., you can probably discuss that cultural elements removed from the trauma are not inherently unifying and can often be harmful when you prioritize one over the other. So when you're proving this, right, the easy cop out is to say that many of these countries are ethnically diverse. And you kind of just stop there. But the problem with that is that it's very easy to kind of rebut. And it's still a bit too broad to really credit as a strong analytical response. So what you want to do is just go deeper into specifics. And there's a better way of explaining why it's hard. Like these cultural elements are just not inherently unifying and can be harmful. Next slide, please. So here's a better way of explaining it. And when I did this round with a bunch of ADS people, I nicknamed this the provincial extensions. Which is one, there are many geographic differences. And what that means is that for many regional festivities and lore and values, it is often tied to varying kinds of culture. So, for example, the vast majority of people in the Philippines will not relate to the Festival of Sinulog or the lore surrounding the Senior Santo Niño in the ways that Cebuanos might do that. And the same might be true for many other localities. And so picking one to be more unifying is incredibly difficult or incredibly costly. Second, that language in these countries are neither uniform nor interchangeable in the vast majority of cases. So for example, the same thing where in the Philippines, you have dialects that stem from some kind of Spanish Creole, like Chavacano. You have Bisaya that is a mix of like Malay and like Indian languages, and like a little bit of Spanish influence. And then you have Tagalog that has a mix of Spanish influence, a bit of um, like Malay, but also a bit of Japanese etymology. And what all of these suggest, and oftentimes in these cases, in trying to unify people through culture and ultimately through language, because language oftentimes reflects the nuance and culture, it is very difficult to uniformly do that because education systems have to adjust to it, but also because there's very low buy-in and high costs. Like it's very difficult to force provincials, for example, well, at least in Cebu, for example, very difficult to force us to speak Filipino or Tagalog colloquially. And that's why we heavily reject it, right? Or third, a strong sense of regionalism stemming from pre-colonial or pre-war times. This relies on a bit of a frame to say that the most important part of this debate are things like post-colonial states, where you can say that back in the day, for example, in Africa, many of these lines and borders were drawn by Europeans who did not understand the ethnic diversity. And so there's a lot of like quibbles, a lot of war that happens because of these inherent disagreements in power and what should be done. So, as you can see, they also kind of claim or prove the same idea that cultural elements removed from the trauma are not inherently unifying and can often be harmful or divisive. But the key difference here is that by being very specific about what that looks like, one, it supplements as analysis because characterization can be very important analysis. But two, it really paints to the judge why the hurdles to doing this are very, very high and very difficult for you to do. So next slide, please. Finally, in explaining why our comparative is better, so we reject the whole using things that are removed from the trauma. Now we want to defend trauma. One, you can say that trauma is very universal and humanizing. And the way to link this in characterizing why people will buy in is that loss is a very human experience. So maybe you have different quibbles about what kind of dialect you want to speak at home or like in society. Maybe you have quibbles about whether Islam or Catholicism should be the main state religion. But what everyone can like connect to and what is just deeply humanizing and universal is the loss of a loved one. Like you lost your brother maybe, and I lost like a grandparent, and feeling that loss viscerally connects people to each other. And second, you can talk about the collective interest to do better in a post-conflict society because people are tired of losing their loved ones, losing their riches or their status, or losing, I guess, their ability to access rights. And you can explain that that is just more totalizing because it's so much more visceral and people connect to that more because while you can have different quibbles about festivities and you can have very like you can use these things to differentiate yourself from other communities in the state, this is a kind of pain that no one was able to escape from, and therefore using that will be more successful in unifying people. So what this example ultimately shows is that you can use very specific ways, specific things that people may or may not agree with, and very specific ways to explain differences in identity to really show why a policy can or cannot work. So finally, the next slide, and this is my last slide before Q&A. The conclusion here is very simple. One, context and characterization are optional parts of a debate. They are fundamental parts to any good debater. My most recent example shows you how you can use characterization to build and strengthen analysis and an argument. But what I explained in the prison example also shows how you can use that to weigh harms and principles to frame out certain parts of the debate. Finally, the best kinds of characterization are inherently a paradox. You want to be specific but generally applicable. It takes a lot of time to practice and perfect. So I know that you guys tend to, or everyone in debate tends to ask, what about my argument? Was it good? What about my rebuttal? Was it good? But you kind of want to have a bit of an emphasis on asking your judges or your coaches as well how you could have improved your characterization, or if the context and the strategy that you took with those two were inherently good fundamentals to the case you built. Because once you fix that, everything else just flows naturally, I promise. So yeah, that's essentially my lecture on context and characterization. We can move on to the Q&A portion. I got a couple of like questions here, so I will just answer it na lang. So first, how to frame well. This is a question for a prime minister friend, especially when you don't know much about the motion. So what I do is actually I keep a list of questions to help me characterize when I don't know anything. And it's up to you guys how you want to do it. It takes a lot of experience or at least a lot of practice to see what kind of natural gaps you have in your skill. But what I did to improve my framing and improve my characterization was just have a list of questions, a panic button, dare I say, to turn to in case I ever had nothing, like there's nothing I knew about the motion. And I would turn to the four metrics I listed earlier. So extent of vulnerability, um, the depth of the harm, the lack of alternatives, etc., etc. And just asking, do these people have alternatives? Yes or no? Can kind of help you extrapolate a bit more, like what you can do with what you have in the motion. Next, so hi, for the example regarding prison systems, what happens if OP tries to talk about dangerous criminals? So this is where you can kind of frame that out, right? And that's where you can rely on your policy. So what you can say, so first level is like not related to this topic specifically, but you can just be like, we return to our policy, which is likely to be that we put these people in rehabilitation centers. That's uniquely different because then you can characterize it there where it's like one, um, one, rehabilitation centers are not run by prison guards who are taught to use force, but oftentimes by therapists and psychologists who are trained and encouraged to empathize with people, right? So that's the first level. The second level is like, perhaps if they're dangerous criminals, they're never going to leave these rehabilitation centers and they are stuck there. So in essence, it is essentially the same, that they are still kept away from broader society and they cannot do harm. And then you frame it very specifically. What does change is that while the handful of dangerous criminals will not be in jail and will not be beaten, they're just gonna go to therapy. The vast majority of people who opt in or who end up doing crime are the ones who are safe from these harms. And then you just kind of weigh it where it's like these people are the most vulnerable. This is like 90% of criminals in the first place. So between hurting the 10% justly, but you have a byproduct of like collateral damage of the remaining 90%, or the vice versa of prioritizing the 90% and maybe a handful of dangerous criminals through the cracks. We would rather not doubly harm people in principle. Then you can layer it with the other thing I talked about, which is like opt-in and disillusionment with the government, and how if you reduce disillusionment, you still reduce the extent of crime people do, and therefore you reduce the amount of harm people on the ground who are not criminals would therefore experience. And that outweighs a handful of dangerous criminals who may not be beaten as much as they deserve to be. So next, what if problems are shared by both sides, like a concession on the issue, perhaps? How can we weigh the material against one another? So this is where, like, if the problem is shared by both sides, it then just becomes a matter of how do you do it better? So maybe you guys both agree that women are harmed and that they both need to improve on the wage gap. But the difference, therefore, becomes how do you reach that end goal? And then it becomes not a question of which issue is the more important. It becomes a question of which kind of solution will people buy into more to reach the same end goal. And then it becomes like does it really incentivize people in the right way? Will people really cooperate with this? Why or why won't they? So a good example of this is the debate, the classic debate of this house would financially incentivize men to take traditionally female jobs. So the end goal on either side is probably that we want to remove gender stereotypes surrounding certain jobs, and probably also make it easier for women to access traditionally male jobs, if men move into traditionally female jobs, right? Like being a nurse, being a flight steward, etc. But what differs therefore is how do we do that, right? So government is going to be like, if we financially incentivize them, they're going to do it because they want money. And if there's more money, it will really change their minds to opt into these traditionally female jobs. But on opt, you can really just be like, will they really? And you can talk about the narratives that affect the way that men might perceive this job to be. So is it really that money is their main priority? Or does status in their career matter just as much? Right? So maybe that's why being a finance bro looks great, even if being a lawyer might earn as much, or being a nurse sometimes arguably can earn as much as well. So you can kind of look at it through that angle, where it's like it boils down to the stimuli question, where will the stimuli really change them and really make them act in the way you want them to act. So same end goal. So it's about just questioning the mechanisms through characterization and talking about the stimuli. Next, okay, I see two more questions here. So how do you think of a good prerequisite as to why some actors do certain actions, or how they would be impacted to avoid the characterizations being too groundless or assertive? My answer is actually listening to debates. So I'd say 90% of debate is not 100% original. It's being able to pick and choose a lot of the knowledge that you've amalgamated over time and adapting it to what the specific motion calls for. And even me, like the things I say here, um, aren't always completely new, but are just things that I've learned to be tricks at work and then nuancing it to the debate. So, for example, the prerequisite as to why some actors do certain actions, the idea of like why people do, like the whole thing about many people doing crime as a result of poverty, as a result of being poor, is actually like a genuine theory in social justice and in crime. I forget what it's called, but like some of those things are just like characterizations and concepts you can adapt into characterizations. As for good prerequisites, it's kind of just like also a bit of common sense and logic. You kind of just have to build a practice in daily life of questioning, like, how did they get this, and building that body of knowledge in the first place. So it's not completely inductive. It's just kind of like curating things you've already digested. So for the motion about prisons, what if Op argues about like the feasibility of rehabilitation? So it kind of boils down to the same thing I've been drilling down here, where it's not just about like everything that comes up in opposition will then just be a question of how will people react to things based on their nature. So a visceral way of doing this is like, let's say you are someone who has experienced poverty. You are someone who turned to crime because you are denied of jobs. You didn't come from a very high income status anyway, so you couldn't afford to go to high school. You had to drop out early to do work, etc., etc. You already don't like the state. You already hate the world that you live in because they have failed you. They're not giving you the opportunities that they're supposed to with the taxes that you pay. Would they be rehabilitated in a prison system where they are faced with more direct forms of abuse and violence? So instead of not getting the welfare that they're supposed to get, they're actively being punched and kicked by people who are sworn to protect the state. Versus in rehabilitation, maybe they're apprehensive, but if you don't do more harm, you don't fuel the narratives that encourage them to do crime in the first place. So it really is looking into what they experience and being very visceral about it. Because doing that makes it hard for your opponents to fully rebut. So yeah, that's essentially it. It seems like I have to wrap up because we do have to go on to the next lecture. We have two more from two very amazing speakers. So I'll stop here and you guys can save your questions for later. I believe if you guys have more questions, you can always send them to Bern. and send them to us, and I can reply back with an answer. So yeah, final words. Thank you guys so much for having me and asking very good questions. I know being a provincial debater is always a bit of a struggle in access, but I hope that you guys really take the best opportunities to get. I know I have, and I have no regrets being here. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, especially with the whole, oh, you need a provincial out there, uh, just like shoot me a message, I guess. Thank you guys, and thank you, Britt.
Thanks so much, Nessie. For the people who still want to ask questions, please save your questions also. We'll be creating a Discord text channel where you can input your questions, and then essentially someone will just reply if it's related to the lecture. Yeah. So now let's begin the second lecture for today's session on framing and impacting. We have Kyle Go, and he's going to be discussing, in essence, what framing is as well as impacting. So, Kyle, if you're ready, I can also screen share if you want. Okay, it seems Kyle is not. Okay, he's here.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Bern. So let me just share my screen. Okay. I guess just some house rules when I do my lecture. Feel free to ask questions at any point in time. We'll also be having Q&A section at the end. So if you want to reserve your questions till then, feel free. If you want to shoot me a message privately because you're a bit shy, that's also okay. Yeah. All right, so let's begin. So welcome to the second lecture for this evening, and I'll be the one running it. It's called Framing and Impacting. So my name is Kyle, but you probably heard people refer to me as KL. That stands for Kyle Luigi because that's my full name. So if you've heard a Kyle or a KL around the circuit, that's probably me. Or I mean, KL is me, but Kyle's probably someone else. But yeah, okay. So this will be the outline that we'll be discussing today. First, we'll be talking about what is framing, and then we'll be talking about what is impacting. So the two basic things that I promise to discuss right now. But more importantly, we'll talk about how they're similar and how they're different, because I think this is something that people can get mixed up quite often, or if not even mixed up. Just some stuff that I want to clarify, because I think there's a lot of confusion about this. Much more so locally. And the third is application in a round. So how do you apply this in a round, and what are the tips and tricks that you can probably use moving forward? Okay, so let's first talk about framing. So framing is essentially how you position your material in a round. So this can be the point of view or underlying assumptions that that your analysis predicates itself on. And a lot of the time, people often talk about framing in the context of setting up a debate, right? Because you say, this is the frame, this is why the debate is set up the way it is. You do this at Prime Minister, LO, or even at a member's speech when you're closing. And what's important there is that when you do framing, it takes into account the weighing of the material. And what this means is that you don't just say, oh, this is the way that the debate should be interpreted, or this should be the lens by which we look at this analysis. But you have to explain why this form of frame is something that is likely to be the frame that the debate should operate upon, right? So basically, it's explaining why this frame is true. Basically explaining why this frame is realistic. So what I'm trying to point out here is that if you build arguments with so much rigor to the degree that you prove it over and over and over again, that it's true, that it's likely to happen, then you should also exercise that same rigor with proving the frame. Because oftentimes, if your frame is unproven, it can be hard to buy why your arguments matter. Because the frame is what dictates, or not really dictates, but it's what allows your arguments to become relevant in the round. And I think that's more important for BP, especially when you're trying to outshine all other teams. Because maybe you build the most robust arguments. Maybe you build the most likely arguments because you have very good analysis for those two. But if you don't explain why these arguments fit into the overview and large context of the debate overall, it becomes incredibly hard to credit you as the most important within the round overall, right? And I guess that differs obviously from format to format. For Asians, it's quite easier, right? Because it's just like building the arguments, make sure they beat other arguments, the opposition, and you win. But for BP, you have to think especially about how does this make sense in comparison to a team who you can't respond to, right? If you're opening, and especially if you have to do the setup quite well. How does this make sense in the way that your arguments are built? Or not even your arguments, but most of the time, even your responses, right? Because maybe let's say you do the grunt work of doing your putting the frame with your arguments very well earlier on, but your responses don't have frame, then, or your responses don't fit into the frame rather, then it all falls apart as well. Your rebuttals become less credited, and therefore you're seen as unresponsive, or your arguments are taken to a lesser degree because you don't respond properly to the opposition's arguments, which are quite strong against your own claims, right? So everything is interrelated. That's the point of this, right? Understanding that not every word, but majority of what you say that's important in your speech is predicated on an assumption, and how you position your round is important, because you would also want to prove why that positioning is important, prove why that positioning is true, and prove why those underlying assumptions is something that the debate should be understood or looked at. Because it's simple, and I want to even put this in the context of a simple conversation, right? If you're having a simple conversation with someone, and let's say you're very, very detailed about, let's say, explaining F1, for example, but your friend just doesn't see the importance of F1, then no matter how skilled you are in talking about Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, how they will do in Bahrain, for example, it doesn't matter because they don't care. So what's important is that you always situate what you're saying in a point of view that would make people understand the material. Because they don't understand the material, then what's the point of you explaining the material, right? So you want to always think about that. Because I think a lot of when we're taught debate training at the start, and this also happened to me when I first started debate training many years ago, I was taught how to make arguments, right? Taught how to make arguments, taught how to make a rebuttal, maybe a bit of setup, but no one really explained what you do in the setup per se. I mean, you talk about the model, you talk about your burdens, but no one really explains what is the assumptions that allow us to come up with a model. What are the assumptions that allow us to prove these burdens to be true? Because you don't take a burden for no reason, right? You take a burden because you want to be able to prove that you can win. Number one, win that burden. Number two, that burden is important. So if your burden does not fit into your frame because it doesn't make sense, then it's very fruitless because you're wasting a lot of time in your speech trying to prove things that don't actually work. And I know that a lot of you guys here are high schoolers or secondary school students. So you probably went to well, I hope you guys went to PSDC. Probably some of you did. Or maybe you went to another high school tournament, or like maybe you've done WSTC before. A lot of what I noticed in these tournaments is that a lot of you high school speakers are very, very good in building. Like I gotta give credit. Like, the rigorous legwork is there. But I think understanding what happens prior is important as well, because if you don't, it's extremely difficult to sort of make your arguments good. And I think this like happens the most with like 3v3 in high school or like WSTC, because I've seen and judged many excellent speakers build the most robust arguments, but they just get beaten by simple responses. And these responses are just framing responses. They say this argument does not apply to this debate, or this argument is less important, or this argument is based on facts or based on a logic that doesn't really make sense, and the argument just falls apart because even you as a judge would have to question, yeah, it's well built, there's an impact, but does it really matter in the round? And that's the problem, right? You want to always start with, why does this matter? Why does this position make sense? Because if you don't explain why it makes sense or why it weighs as important, it's very hard to buy, even if you've done everything else perfectly. So let's use an example. This was a motion in Worlds this year. So this motion is, this house supports the remilitarization of Japan. So I guess like let's do some participation. If you guys are enthusiastic about participation, you can just PM, you can just like privately message me if you're a bit shy. But I also encourage you guys to like unmute or like type it in everyone chat so everyone can see. But so let's say this motion, let's say you're Gov or OG, and you're talking about this house, and you have to defend why the remilitarization of Japan should take place, or why Japan should remilitarize. What is a potential frame, an initial potential frame that you guys could use before you even jump into the arguments? Or I guess if you want, you can like explain to me as well what argument you would run, and then maybe explain the frame behind that argument. I guess I'll give you guys like a bit. And if no one messages me or unmutes, then I guess we'll just proceed. I mean, like I'll explain my thoughts. So I guess I'll give you like guys like 2-3 minutes. Okay, so I got one response in chat. And then if anyone else wants to share, feel free. If not, I will proceed with my thoughts. So we got here one from chat. The frame that they believe is North Korean / Chinese aggression comes to mind. Okay, so this is a valid and fair frame to take. So the reason why you want to support the remilitarization of Japan is because you believe that there is a huge amount of aggression from North Korea and China. And obviously, pretty empirically true. I guess we should all know as well that North Korea is an active enemy of Japan. And China, for the most part, is, indifferent towards North Korea, or is like somewhat supportive of North Korea. And yeah, China also has its own aggressions against Japan, like in the Senkaku and Yaoyu Islands. So there's a lot of aggression from nearby neighbors and hostile neighbors. So that's a fair frame or a valid frame to take because it provides context and it provides a sort of broad overview that situates your argument already. Because, I mean, you probably would run an argument that you need to remilitarize Japan right now. This needs to be self-sufficient. It needs to be able to show a show of force, for example, to deter its neighbors from being more aggressive. But if your claim is that you want to show a show of force, you want to have a show of force because you want to deter your enemies from attacking, then you first have to explain why do you need a show of force, right? Because if I'm a judge and I listen, okay, so your argument is you tell me Japan should remilitarize because it wants to have a strong face, show force in the region, deter to deter its enemies from attacking them, or deter its enemies. The first question that will come into my mind is, why will Japan want to deter its enemies? What are its enemies doing? Like, I know they have enemies like North Korea, China, but they've existed for like almost a century, right? So what are they doing right now? What is the current context that the debate takes place in? And there was a mention that it was aggression. And that's correct, right? Because you have current threats of aggression. And this has been going on for the past 5-10 years, where China's actively been trying to step into Japan's sovereign territory, and you also have North Korea always shooting up hydrogen bombs and ICBMs over the Sea of Japan. So clearly it's a threat. So yes, that's a valid frame to take. So I got more responses. Thank you for people sending it in. I'll read the next response. The framing should be on how status quo, the threats of China is very evident, especially when it comes to exerting its military power over other Asian countries, especially on the waters, and with Japan being one of the few countries having the access or power to actually militarize. And being in a strategic geographical position, we should support it. So there's like a bit of argumentation here, but essentially, it's quite similar to the first, wherein you have threats in the region that actively want to undermine your sovereignty and undermine your national security as Japan, China. So yes. And then there's a second part here that I think is also important. Japan being one of the few countries having the access or power to actually militarize in the region. So I think that is slightly true. So I think Japan has a very good manufacturing base for a lot of its weapons. So it's able to create a lot of weapons, and then sell them abroad. So that's a very strong base to be able to do this. It wants to manufacture its own and then kickstart its standing army, because it just has a self-defense force right now. The thing is that this frame is also not true. I'm not fully true to the greatest degree, because the US also stations its 7th fleet, I think, or it stations a fleet in the region in East Asia, for support to South Korea and Japan. So what that suggests is that Japan is not the only power player in the region, right? And that could potentially be an opposition line of attack to say, hey, wait a minute, we don't need to remilitarize Japan because the US is there anyway, South Korea is there anyway, and they're all in the same region. So I think you saying that Japan has a good idea of the region, geographically aware, is true, but it doesn't really put a lot of it doesn't have a lot of weight that much in the debate, because you also have other power players in the region who also know it quite well. Like, it's zero sum, right? Because North Korea knows the region well, South Korea knows the region well, the US knows the region well. It's not like a situation in the Middle East where it hasn't been explored that much that, you'd have advantages, let's say, for fighting terrorists who hide in mountains or in the desert, or where it's harder to find them. But yes, that frame is also valid. The next thing I got is, could it be about retrospectively why Japan didn't militarize at the first place, like World War II or something like that? Yes, definitely. So for those who don't know, Japan is like a self-defense clause in their constitution. Like they can't like have a standing army, only like a self-defense force. So they can't like venture out and like essentially like they can only like do something when they get attacked, or like if it's there's a clear imminent national threat. But it's not like they can send their military out for like aggression purposes, like deter other countries. Yes, so that's a perfectly valid frame. Like, you explain that, hey, look, right now we have constitutional constraints. So let's say again, we go back to the first argument that you want to remilitarize Japan to deter enemies. The question will be like, the judge's question might be like, wait a minute, but why do we need that deterrence to begin with? And that's when you explain, it's because retrospectively they had to be pacifists. So yeah, perfectly valid frame. Thank you guys. Last here that we have is place with the Quad in protecting Taiwan. But doesn't the US have bases in Japan? Yes. So okay, this is like a big question or a big statement. So yes, it also plays with the Quad. So the Quad is the regional defense force. That's the recent defense agreement in the region between Australia, Japan, the US, and a couple of others. It's essentially, it's to be able to contain China and contain threats in the region such as North Korea. So yes, this is how Japan could boost its Quad military capabilities. And you also would get lots of support for it because the Quad is actively encouraging Japan to do such a thing. So that's a perfectly valid frame, and quite a good frame, actually. And the second one is that, yes, Taiwan plays a role sort of as well. Because if you know, so this is like a bit more auxiliary towards the discussion. But if you read up on this, there's like something called the island chain strategy of the US. So the island chain strategy is where the US positions like different military bases along the island chains that actually starts at the northern tip of Luzon, starts from Luzon, stretching all the way to like Okinawa to like contain Chinese aggression from like entering the Pacific. So it's like a deterrent strategy basically, because the US is signaling it can cut off Chinese supply routes, which are often on the coastlines, like big cities like Hong Kong, Shanghai, etc. The point at which China tries to invade Taiwan. And yes, the US does have bases, the biggest one in Okinawa, I think. So yeah, all these are very important because it provides a lot of credence towards potential argumentation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for sending in your responses. I appreciate that. All right, so now we'll talk about impacting. Again, if you have any questions, just feel free to raise it up at any point in time. Okay, so what is impacting? I think it's three broad things, and we'll also explain this with an example later on. So the first is that it's explaining what your responses or your analysis, or essentially the material, positive or negative material, does to the round once you launch it, right? So let's say you explain that Japan should remilitarize because it needs to deter, let's say, because it needs to deter its enemies. What is the impact of that argument? What does it do towards the round, right? What does it do towards your case? What is the end goal, essentially? But most importantly, or more importantly, it also ties into explaining the importance of the material to the clashes, right? So at the start, you have your burdens. These are the things that you want to solve in the round. You promise to resolve. And later down the line, you realize these burdens fit into clashes, right? So if it's a clash about where we safer, it's a clash about where we get more development, it's a clash about where do we enhance certain principles or practical outcomes. The impact is essentially why your material wins you that clash, right? Because you explain that this material leads to this thing, and that thing, which is the impact, wins this clash, right? Why does it win that clash is what you're explaining with the impact. And I think like for a lot of high school debaters, oftentimes you get this, I don't want to say confused because I don't think it's confusing, but I do think like you package this with like the conclusion or the end point of a response or an argumentation. So at the end, you explain, oh, this is the impact, this is what it means. But what I'm saying here is that you also have to do the additional sort of due diligence in explaining why that impact is important to the clashes of the round. Why does it win you the debate? Or why does it even win you a clash, right? Because I think sometimes what happens as well is you have all these, okay, let's say you have the frame thought out. Brilliant frame, brilliant argumentation, stellar response. But you don't exactly explain to me why does it win you the clash? Like, what does it do? Because sometimes, even if that final piece of analysis is very, very, very intuitive, sometimes it's very hard to credit your case to the fullest extent because you don't explain that impact. So again, going back, doing your due diligence is very, very important. So let's do that with an example. So this example is, or the example is, this house would prohibit fossil fuel companies from heavily investing into green and renewable energy companies. So this was taken from a pre-UADC tournament last year. But yeah, so this is the motion. I'll give you guys another 2 to 3 minutes. Think it out. If you want to chat anything, feel free. So like this time, sort of like give me an impact. Let's say we're opening government, or your gov bench. Tell me an impact. And if you want to like add like a precursor of analysis to explain the impact or explain the impact, that's also fine. See, I'll give people like 2 to 3 minutes. Sorry, let's do opposition actually, since we did government last time. Let's do opposition this time. Okay, so no one has messaged me, but that's fine. Again, if you have thoughts, just keep dropping them or like unmute, open your mic. That's okay. But I guess we'll start. So let's say we're opposition. So for opposition, we basically allow the fossil fuel companies to heavily invest into green and renewable energy companies. Oh, I got a message. Wonderful. Oh, multiple messages. Okay, great, great. So we'll start here from the messages. Can you run us off the principle of having more of a good guy image in the industry? Like more people seeing you as less of a threat to the environment and more of an eco-friendly company. Good optics, essentially. So yes, that's essentially the end impact, right? You wouldn't prohibit fossil fuel companies because they would want to do this for CSR purposes, right? Good, look good, sustainable, all of that, yada yada. However, I want to point out that that's not really like a full impact, and the reason why is because if you look at the way the motion is worded, it's not like this house supports fossil fuel companies or like this house, in that way that you would like defend it on upright. It's a prohibition or it's the existence of a prohibition or not. So it's not about in theory should companies do this. The question is in theory should we ban companies. So it's not about like you saying that the end impact is that they will support it, right? Or rather that they would do it because of CSR. But what you're saying is that, or the person that messaged me, is that the good optics is the reason why fossil fuel companies would do the heavy investment, right? Because if you're up, there's no fiat to say that fossil fuel companies will automatically invest. You have to prove it, right? So what was messaged to me was the reason why they would do it for the good optics. So it's sort of an impact because you're giving me a reason why the prohibition should not be there, but you're not exactly explaining to me why is it that this is overall like a good thing, so to speak, right? So if you don't prohibit them and you allow them to heavily invest, why is that overall good? So I think like you answer of the like one part of it, which is fair. You give like a very good justification, but I think the second part is a bit missing. But let's go over the next few responses. With a huge amount of money fossil fuel companies make, a prohibition equals huge loss of money for green and renewable energy, which can slow down our transition from fossil fuel to green energy. Okay, yes. So this is actually an impact. So you're essentially saying that if you prohibit them, you're losing out on funding towards green companies, which is correct. That's true. That is an impact, right? Because you're not allowing them to invest in green technology, or green renewable energy companies rather. So even if they are able to invest to a very, very small degree in like some products or something in their own company, it doesn't really transition a lot. So that's okay. That's one clear impact. So thank you for that. Let's go to the next. I think the true comparative could be that the companies are about to deplete in a few years. On Gov, you could kind of waste the resources that you get from companies because you prohibit them. And it's worse because even if they actually enter the market, it's already too late. On Op, even if it's tokenistic, at least you have far more investment, especially towards startups. Yes. So I'll talk about Op first. So yes, Op, that is the good worst case weighing, which is if it's tokenistic, at least you have investment towards these renewable energy startups, which is, again, let's go back to the frame. A lot of these renewable energy companies are startups starting up because they're non-traditional, right? They're non-conglo, they're non MNC, or I mean most of them aren't. So yes, you at least get more investment towards startups. I think like the extension of that impact is just explaining why having more funding towards startups is good, which is intuitive. On Gov, you waste the resources that you would get from companies because you prohibit them. And yeah, yes. Actually, I think what you're saying is that a response. So if that's a response, yes, that's the impact of the response that you, number one, waste more resources, and number two, when they enter the market, it's a bit too late. So that's a good like timeline response. Let's do it now, bad, later, also bad. So that's good. Thank you for that. Lastly, it minimizes the harmful environmental impacts that a fossil fuel company that fossil fuel companies generate. It is a way to compensate for fossil fuel companies occupy a considerably scarce industry with not much competition, so they have the resource to invest in renewable energy companies enough to make it effective. Yes, it minimizes the harmful environmental impacts. So yes, this is an impact. But I think it needs to be proven, right? It is a potential impact, but it needs a lot of proof. And it's okay, because I didn't ask for the proof, right? But I'm just explaining that if we're going to run this in debate, I would highly suggest you have a lot of proof, because the way that you have to like position this is that on off, theoretically, fossil fuel companies would still have their own like oil and gas and like shale mining shale extraction like plants, right? Why is it that when they invest in the green renewable energy, either number one, that will eventually phase out, or number two, why their investment there would outweigh whatever environmental damage they have with their original industry, which is, oil and fossil fuels. So I think this impact works. You just have a lot of legwork to prove it. Because I think the environmental impact in this debate is quite hard to prove. Not hard, it takes a lot of steps. So I think like doing that would require a lot of work to do, which I recommend to do. I mean, this was an Asians motion, so there's more time to prep, more time to bring out the material. But second, most importantly, this is why framing is important, right? You have to frame why companies would want to invest. Because again, the motion does not presume that they would automatically invest. It just says, if you're up, no prohibition. But it's like not banning, right? But not banning does not mean they would automatically do it. So you'd have to prove the delta, why they would. And then you can get all the impacts you guys talk about. Okay, so thank you. Thank you, everyone. Again, if you guys have questions, feel free to raise it. So now let's do the comparisons, the similarities and difference I promised earlier. So how do they tie together, essentially? So I think there's three things. Number one, framing is necessary to make your impacts relevant in the round and why it makes sense in the context of the debate. So again, as we talked about in the previous motion, none of your impacts on helping the environment or investment or loss of money, etc., won't exactly make sense if you don't understand first what is the market of fossil fuel, what is the market of green energy, right? How do these two markets operate together? What is the energy market all about? Understanding that would be helpful. The second is that impacts provide you with solvency in the realm to be able to claim that a harm or benefit or harm accrues. Sorry, that's supposed to be framing. Framing slash impact. So both framing and both impacting provide you with solvency. That means that it provides you with a truth sort of mechanism to explain why you'd be able to claim that you get this benefit or the other team incurs this harm. So it's important because you need that solvency to be able to show to the judge that, hey, there is a possibility and there is a likelihood that what we're saying as our benefits to win the debate or harms to prove why the other side does not win the debate makes sense in the round. Because if you don't prove that, or you don't get that level of solvency, it becomes difficult to believe. But again, all of these are underpinned by the idea that you need the frame to allow your impacts or even your analysis, which is prior to the impact or is a precursor to the impact, to make sense. That's how they tie together. And lastly, I know a lot of you might already know about this, but both can be proven separately. And when you're starting out, I guess that's advisable because you're new to debate, for example. Even making arguments might be difficult. So maybe at first, again, try to separate them first. Do one at a time. Give yourself some leeway. Do some practices individually for both of them and not rush into it. But always having a relation to both, tying them together, is important, especially in winning very, very close rounds. Because sometimes at the end of the day, it's not about how well you build the argument anymore that defines defines if you win the debate, right? It's about whether or not they believe your arguments to be true in the context of your impacts also fitting, sorry, in the sense that your impacts fit into the context or the likely situation the debate takes place in. Okay, so last thing we'll talk about is the application. How does this apply in debates? So I think there's a couple of ways. Number one, you want to use framing to make your claims more persuasive in instances where they could be flipped. So what this means is that this is a protection against potential responses your opponent might have. And it's that you want to use framing to already hedge against the potential attacks your opponent might have. So maybe your framing might not be the most debate winning for your own arguments, but you want to be able to show that your framing protects you against any potential responses. So let's say your opponent has a very debate winning response, but maybe it just doesn't fit in the round. Like maybe they respond to your case by saying that, hey, look, it doesn't work in this very extremely specific situation. Then okay, but it's out of the round because it would still work. Your analysis would probably still work in the vast majority of cases. And so you already want to hedge what this debate's about, right? And hedge that this is a situation in the vast majority of instances that we'll probably be operating around. Second, this can come out in extensions, responses, weighing, and it depends when you how to use it. So what this means is that framing and impacting does not always have to necessarily come at the start and at the end. It comes out when you feel it's necessary, when it's important to proving a point. And it really takes a lot of experience, I would say, and a lot of discarte to understand when to put in the frame properly. Because sometimes maybe you say the frame earlier on, but it just becomes so washed out by all the other material that people forget about it. It isn't as relevant. So you also want to think about when you want to position what you're saying, as with any speech writing activity. Okay, grounding your claims with empirical evidence examples also helps improving the frame. So let's say that you assert the frame that, okay, this is how the world is likely to look like. This is how the world is likely to operate in. It would help if you have examples, maybe draw a bit of a story that's proven from facts, obviously. Explain the situation, a parallelism, and why that's like in the vast majority of cases. And then use that as like, this is why the frame is likely to be true, and likely to be useful, or it's important in the round overall. Because you also you become more persuasive with those examples and evidence provided. Lastly, and I think this is more important, not more important, but I think it's very, very important for dynamics as a team. But always try to agree with your partner in the frame. And this is important because I've seen teams lose debates just because the first speaker situated their argument in, let's say, place X, and then speaker number 2 situates in place B or place Y. Basically, 2 competing situations. And that's not wrong, okay? That can happen. But you want to flag that you're not contradicting your first speaker. And maybe your analysis like an alternative world if you try to look from a different lens, or an even if analysis, right? Because you want to make sure that what your first speaker said is still there as relevant material. Because that's what your judge is tracking most of the time. The first speaker's case is very, very crucial because it sets up your case line, right? And a lot of the frame is integrated there. And you can obviously run alternative frames in your round, but they should not sort of like impede on what your first speaker said. Because if it does, it becomes very hard then to judge, oh, so which speaker should we believe as to be more important in the judge's head? Because you have these frames which don't necessarily complement one another. Obviously, if your partner missed out something and you add a frame which complements it and it's not like an alternative or even if it goes against it, then it's fine, right? That's no problem. But in the instances where it does, you have to be transparent and agree on things. Okay, so yeah, that ends the lecture for the day. I guess the last 10 minutes we can devote to questions. So again, if anyone has any questions, you can unmute, message me privately, message it in the everyone chat. Feel free. I'll give you guys like 5 minutes or so I can also have like 5 minutes to answer. And then if there's none, we can move on to the last lecture of the day. All right, we have one question. How do you integrate framing into arguments? And is it better to integrate framing into arguments? Yeah, so I think I mentioned this a while ago, but that's a good question. So essentially, you would want to package your argumentation. So when you do your arguments, diba, you have a part there that usually explains why this argument makes sense. Why is this argument important or crucial in the round? You can package your framing there. You say it makes sense that this argument is crucial to the round because this is the context, or even prior to the argument. It really depends on how you structure your speech, and I don't want to impose, right? But yes, I would say it is better to integrate framing into arguments because as you move on to like more and more debates, you would realize that not everything has to have a super defined or like cut out structure. Like you don't have to say, okay, this is the burden, this is the frame, this is the argumentation. It all just jives together well, right? And so I don't want to say that it's better to integrate it or not. But the point is you would want whatever you're saying to make sense in a way that appeals both logically and appeals as well based on what you're saying empirically, right? So you would want what your argument is trying to prove to situate itself, making sense logically based on like your frame and all these things. Maybe you built that frame as well, or you proved likely that frame, or situation your argument to be empirically true as well, based on you proving some level of analysis in the or empirical or like grounding in the frame. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. If not, you can like shoot a follow-up. But yeah, if there's any other questions, people just feel free to type it or unmute. Oh, there we go. As closing, is it still possible to redirect the round in your own framing if you think the framing of the opening round is not relevant? Or is it more easy to just follow up with how you set up the round? Very good question. The answer is the first. You are more than welcome to always redirect the debate in your own framing. But just make sure that when you say your frame is more important than opening, you prove it to be true. Because I think a lot of like extension speakers in closing say that, oh, our frame is the more important frame. It's the debate winning frame. But if you don't prove it, then it's all just words, right? So do your due diligence. When you say it's the more important frame than your opening, prove it to be true. But also doing the second one is also okay. It's not out of the window, right? So if you feel like you running a better argumentation because your opening already had a good frame but had a bad argument, that's okay. And you can just say that, hey, look, guys, opening didn't run the argument properly. They give bad responses. We do those two things properly. And look, opening set the debate up properly. They had a good frame, but they never fulfilled their frame. They never explained why their frame would actually be relevant because their arguments did not make sense. And we did that legwork. We proved to you why their frame is important based on these arguments that we proved better than our opening. So yeah, that is still working with an openings frame, but you're just showing why you did their job better, basically. Okay. I normally operate on Asian Parliamentary in Oxford. Do you have any tips in general? Okay, I don't know what the Oxford format is, but I think it's also 3v3, I think. or it's like prop and gov. Sorry, affirmative and negative, prop and op. But yes, 3v3. Essentially for 3v3, what's important here is that you would want to make it so that when you explain your arguments or even your responses or any material, you explain why it links directly to the clash, because the clash is what determines you winning or losing a 3v3, because it's just one team, right? One team versus one team. And therefore, it won't be defined on, oh, who had the flashiest or most brilliant material, or who had the best debate dynamics of outweighing and stuff. But it's really about, did you win the clash? Did your arguments beat out the other team's arguments? And in that specific scenario, we go back to, what does framing and impacting lead towards your case, right? It provides you with solvency, or rather, it helps you with the solvency. It provides you with the explanation why your arguments are better, or even allows you to remove or make it harder for them to win based on their own material, right? So all of these things make it better for you. But I guess the mindset in a 3v3 is that it's easier to directly beat out your opponent from achieving their path to victory in a clash, or allowing their argument to be true to win the clash. Because then you can use the frame to show that they don't actually win the clash. Their argument does not actually prove the clash or benefit that the clash is trying to explain. Okay. So we have a couple more minutes. I'll give it 2 minutes. If no one launches any more questions, we'll move on to the next speaker. All right. We got one last question. Any tips for PM? I'm a second speaker forced to PM. I've been there. But yes, tips for PM. Actually, I think PM is like one of the, if you're going to PM and you heard this lecture, I think you're in a good spot, because you have the most amount of room to practice setting up and impacting well, because you don't have to worry about time constraints for responses. So what I would say, the best situation here is to practice. Give prep a case, give a speech. If you're PMing, because that helps with the setup. And it's easier to break down your speech because it's not confuddled in all of the, oh, this is the response, this is like some extra response, this is some weighing, etc. against the other team, right? It's all just you, just your speech. So if you can maybe break down your speech like into different components to help you practice, only for practice purposes, obviously, that would be helpful. And obviously, as you get more and more used to it, it would be helpful in round as well. So yes, practice for PM. I hope that helps. That ends my session. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys learned a lot. So if you want to ask me like for anything else or anything else, yeah, really anything, feel free to like reach out on Facebook, or I guess you can also like just message the Ateneo Debate Society, and then we'll try to get back to you, and I'll also make sure to get back to you. So yeah, thanks so much, everybody. I really enjoy your responses. Enjoy this lecture as well, and wishing you guys all the best. Hopefully see you around in many more tournaments, and hopefully see you in next year's PSDC if you guys are still eligible. So yep, now I'll be moving on. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Gail. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to keep them. Take note of it, and then we recently opened a text channel in the Discord server where you can indicate your questions, and then members of the ADS will respond in due time. So if you have any clarifications that we couldn't fit within the allotted time slot for the schedule, please feel free to just put it there. Now for our final lecture on today's session on staging the debate, we're going to call on Chelsea Fernandez. Chelsea to talk about staging the debate or reading the debate. So yeah.
Hi, they wanted to show themselves on camera before I started. Okay. Okay. So if Orgom could share screen. Okay, thank you. Okay, so hi, my name is Chelsea. I am a member of the ADS, and unlike Nessie, I'm not a provincial debater, but I am a provincial. So if there are any Mindanaoans in the chat, that's cool. Okay. So reading the debate. So the way that my lecture is basically gonna go is first we'll talk about how to track the round strategically, and then how to identify and analyze clashes and respond to them. And then third, we'll talk about deadlocks. And then fourth, we'll talk about what to do when your opponent runs something that you really didn't expect them to run. Okay, so first, let's talk about tracking the round. And by the way, this lecture will be interactive at some points. I'm going to ask questions. So please raise your hand if you guys want to answer. And also if you have any questions right now about the topic in general, please send them in the chat. So I can get to them during my lecture. Okay, so first let's talk about tracking the round. So how do you track the round? The first thing I want to note is that you don't have to write everything down. So when you are inside of the round, there is a temptation to, because people are saying so much stuff at a time, there is a temptation to just sort of write everything down and then just say, oh, I'll analyze it later, I'll respond to it later. But that can be really, really bad because one, there's a limited amount of time that you have to prepare your case and to prepare your responses. And if you write everything, if you spend all your time writing everything down, you don't really have time to think of strategic ways to respond to it or strategic things to of how to weigh it within the debate. And that's where you kind of get lost in like the content of it all. So the first thing to do is to prep strategically. So when you're a second speaker, sometimes you tend to forget that you also have to prep, especially for example when you're whip and you have like and you're going to and they're going to be like 8 speakers speaking before you. But even if you're like deputy or whip and there's someone else on your team that's speaking before you, the first thing that you have to do is to anticipate the clash, right? And I'll talk more about clashes later. But basically anticipate the kinds of issues that are going to come out in the debate. Try to think about what the opponent is going to run and not just what's good for your case. So for example, the way that I prep is I cut my prep paper in half, right? So the left side are the wins or the arguments or frames that you could use to win your side for government or opposition or whatever you are. And then the other side of the paper is used to predict what the opposing side might say. So these can be things like uh frames that they might contend or responses that they might launch at us or entire arguments that they're going to forward later on. And you don't have to do it in detail, of course. You should spend the majority of your time actually prepping your case. But it is good to have sort of a framework or to have an expectation of how the debate is going to go so that in prep and while your teammate is speaking, you already have an idea of how you're going to respond or how you're going to weigh. So the things that I want you to prep when you're prepping are things that are, first of all, points of contention, for example, in the frame. So if you think that for example, in a debate about, let's say, let's say corporations, right, or governments, there is always a tendency for teams to characterize corporations as bad or governments as bad, and those characterizations are characterizations sometimes that are challenged because the other team has like a case where they rely on the government being good for it to fly. So things like that. Um, when you're prepping and when you're prepping clashes, or when you're prepping clashes, you have to be able to note what are the major cases of your opponent and what are the points of analysis or the points of framing that are needed for that case to be able to fly in the round. And that's how you build responses to them within prep. The second thing is that again, don't write everything down. And while this can be hard uh to get the hang of, especially if you're not familiar with the medium that you're debating in. So for example, if you were an online debater, you're transitioning to face, or if you're a face-to-face debater transitioning to online, it can be very tempting to just write everything down so that you sort of like don't have to sort it in your head a bit. But don't be afraid to put the pen down when necessary, because a large majority of the time, um you don't really have to write everything down or transcribe the entire debate in order to win. You only have to note the intent of the speeches or the intent of the case, and that is how you are going to respond to them or weigh that argument within the round. So if you're getting lost, if you're, for example, if your opponent is a very matter heavy debater, or if they speak really fast, or if they have no like inflections in their speech, and you're getting kind of confused about what's important and what's not important, don't be afraid to just put your pen down, just listen, and then listen for the points where that are going to be important within the round. The third thing is that again, listen to the intent of the arguments, right? So what are they really trying to say? So this is especially true when you're arguing rounds, when you're arguing against debaters or arguing motions that are very, very matter heavy. It can be really easy to get lost in responding to specific examples. Like, for example, the the debater, one of the debaters says na, oh, for example, let's say Russia, is as part of the Security Council, gets to decide how to respond to, for example, the conflict in Ukraine, and therefore we shouldn't let the Security Council decide. Therefore we shouldn't let like the Security Council have veto power, things like that. And then the way that, for example, the way that you respond to it is to say that, well, uh actually Russia is no longer on the Security Council because they kicked them out. Um, Even though you responded to the example, the intent of that case was to say that powerful countries should not have the ability to veto very important decisions within the UN. So even if you took down the fact that Russia was no longer in the Security Council, the intent of the case in the analysis of it could have been something like, oh, they have other interests. Their interest isn't in forwarding world peace. It's actually to forward their own interests. They're very, very powerful, etc., etc. So even though you took down their example and even though you took down their matter, their case still stands. So really try to sift through everything that your opponent is saying, and take note of the things that you have to take down in order to respond to that case, not the matter, not the examples, but the actual layers of analysis and reasoning why their arguments are true. And then the second thing I wanted to do when tracking things with intent is to notice how specific arguments or specific parts of the speech position your opponent within the round and how it affects your case. So for example, if your opponent has a case wherein they specifically prove why um why, let's say, the US government is good, and for example, why the US is, yeah, why the US government is good. And then your prepared case as opposition is to say that the US government is bad. Um, make sure that you're able to take that down, because that is a necessary response that you have to do before you can move on to your argumentation about why the US is bad. So things like that. Note, so generally it's like three things, right? It's one, it's to prep strategically within the class, strategically within the prep time. So anticipate the clash and make sure that you know what the debate is about generally before going on to the round. The second thing is rebut, or like track with intent. So make sure that you're able to note what your opponent is really trying to say and what case they're trying to forward within the round, even independent of the matter and the examples they're using to simplify it. And then thirdly, make sure that you know how these things are positioned within the round and how they affect your case, because that is the way that you know how to respond to them later on. And then the fourth thing is generally just prioritize certain layers of argumentation over the other. So if you think that one argument is more important to the debate or has more impact on the debate, for example, it's okay to respond to that first, or it's okay to spend more time taking it down over other things. So that is how generally you track the round. I suggest what I do generally is I have one sheet of paper. If you're a paper debater, uh I have one sheet of paper that is only specifically used for tracking the round, especially when I'm at the whip. So I have papers for my arguments, for my responses, but I have one sheet of paper that is divided in four sections. So that's OG, OO, CG, and then sometimes and then CO, but I don't really track CO if I'm closing up. Um, that's divided into four sections, and that is where I write everything down. And it's important that you have a limited amount of space, for me at least, that I have a limited amount of space to track everything, so that I don't write everything down, so that I only write the most important things and the things that are most relevant to my responses. So that is generally how you track the round. The next thing we want to do is to find out how to identify and to analyze clashes in the debate. By the way, guys, if you have any questions, again, just send it in the chat while the lecture is going on. But we will also have a Q&A later. So, ayun, identifying and analyzing clashes. Next slide. Okay, so what are clashes? Clashes are common issues or major disagreements within the debate. So, generally things like what are we trying to is this is the solution effective? Do we get buy-in if it's a soft motion? Things like, are we going to solve climate change? Are we going to save lives? Things like that. Those are the major clashes within the debate, right? They're usually judged according to how likely each side is to solving that clash, or to winning that clash, and which clashes are more important for the debaters to win. So specifically within the Woodsy manual, it states that um actually no, specifically within the Woodsy manual, it states that the the clashes are to be judged based on how convincing you how much you convince the adjudicator that you win the clash. So which side is generally able to provide more rigorous argumentation, for example, etc., etc. But it's also important to note that even if you win like minor clashes within the debate, it doesn't mean that you're going to win the entire round as is, because there are also clashes that are more important or have more of an impact in the round. And those are generally the clashes that you want to win more. So I'll talk about that more on later when we have like example, when I have like actual examples to show you like actual motions. But yeah, generally they're judged according to how likely you are able to prove that you win that issue, like how you're likely able to prove that you solve climate change or how you save lives in this country, and how important that actually is. So generally, there are a lot of debates where there are recurring clashes, and this is where we get to like canned arguments, where you have arguments prepared in your mind based on like previous debates that you've joined or judged, for example, or even just heard on the internet. Um, Generally there will be clashes that recur over time that are going to be like very very similar to each other, and then the way that you win that is just to find the nuance within the specific motion that you're debating. um so if we go to the next slide, right, uh I have three motions, and these motions are all generally very like they're all generally like different motion types. So one is a regrets motion, one is stage BT, and one of them is this house supports. Um, they're also like different. Uh, they're also kind of different themes. Like one is on Sokmov, one is on feminism, and one is on the environmental movement. So I want you guys to look at the to read these motions and to analyze what the common clashes of the debate of these motions are. Like if these motions were going to debate to be debated, how what are these similarities between the debate what are these similarities between the debates that are going to occur with this motion. I'll give you guys like a minute, and then you guys can raise your hand or type in the chat if you want to answer. So just go. Okay, so one of you guys answered, how would the movements further spread their message effectively? So that's right. So one of the clashes in this, one of the clashes that are going to happen in these motions are how effective the messaging is going to be, because generally they're about social movements or like yeah, broad social movements. And the interests of those social movements are generally in how they're able to more effectively like convince people that their cause is important, right? And then another one of you guys answered where movements are better heard or more productive. That's right. So there are two things to this, right? The first is on the effectivity of the message. So how convincing is it going to be for the feminist movement to convince people to join feminism if they advocate for female conscription? Or how effective is it going to be for people to be convinced to join the environmental movement if they shame individuals for not being environmentally friendly? Things like that. So the effectivity of the message is one, and generally you're going to have to do a little bit of proving within the debate to prove why the having more effective messaging is good. But generally it's very very agreed upon that effectivity is important in social movement debates. And then the second thing, it's on buy-in. So this is where I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say who answered, but like one of you guys answered where movements are better heard. The second thing is on buy-in. So um how yeah, so that's generally like if people are going to be incentivized to actually like actively support or actively oppose the movement if and ever they impose these kinds of solutions. And then the third thing, which again another one of you guys answered, is how does it change the internal structures of movements, i.e. do people within the movements agree or not? So the third thing is about on how the movement is going to look like moving forward. So if, for example, you commercialize feminism, how are the more like anti-capitalist feminists going to treat that? And are they going to still buy into the mainstream feminist movement, or are they still going to actively support feminist organizations if ever it's very, very commercialized to that point? So those are the three recurring clashes that are going to happen in this debate, in these debates, right? And generally what you have to do is, one, just listen to debates in general, like debate more, case build more, listen to like watch debates more on YouTube, so that you're able to get a sense of what you're supposed to do when these debates come up. And then the second thing is, when you already know what you're supposed to do in these kinds of debates, the only thing that you have to do is to nuance it to the clash that is specifically said in the motion. So if it's a regrets motion, for example, you have to prove why the counterfactual is likely, and why the counterfactual is likely, why it's good, why it's bad, what does the commercialization specifically, how does the commercialization specifically affect social movements in particular, and how does the commercialization manifest in real life? If it's a this house believes that motion, you have to prove the truth value. You have to talk about how South Korean feminism looks like in particular and in comparison to other feminist movements around the globe. But generally, when you already have a sense of what you're supposed to do in specific motions and in specific motion types, then that is when you're able um uh to sort of breeze through the technical aspects of debate and really nuance it to the motion, so that the judge is more inclined to give you the win based on things like burden fulfillment, etc. So yeah, uh quick like exercise on common clashes in debate. And if you go to the next slide, yeah, so breaking deadlock. What is a deadlock? So a deadlock is a clash that both sides are not able to convincingly resolve. So it's either it usually comes from two things, right? It's either that people are too charitable and there is no delta that exists, or like no delta that is significant enough to win the clash for the edge, or both sides are not engaging enough and therefore they're just arguing with each other and not giving each other the benefit of the doubt. So generally deadlocks look like, for example, if um PM is saying that PM, like let's say the motion is a motion about how you raise children. If you should raise children to be more passionate about their goals, or if you should raise children to be more like outcome oriented. So opposite PM might say, well, we want children to be happy. We want children to like what they're doing in life, right? And then opposition says, well, we actually want children to have money so that they're able to be happy. So both sides generally want their kids to be happy. The deadlock then exists because both sides are unable to engage with each other on the assumption that happiness can exist on both sides, or that success can exist on both sides. The way that you resolve this deadlock then, if you go to the next slide, the way that you resolve this deadlock then is generally four things. So first, you can give new characterizations. So you can say, for example, that your that at op, for example, you can say, well, if you are if you're very, very passionate about your goals and it doesn't succeed, then that passion is eventually going to burn out. And so it doesn't matter in the first place if you're passionate or not. We just want you to succeed. So that's a new characterization that can respond to the material coming from OG, that can break the deadlock if executed correctly. The second thing is you can point out the most mutually exclusive impacts, right? So a lot of the time in debate, um, a lot of the time in debate, both sides are going to argue for the same things. Generally, people are going to argue for people being happier, or people getting more money, or people just not dying. There are a lot of debates about saving lives, etc., etc. There are going to be impacts that can be forwarded on both sides of the debate if you argue it correctly. What you have to do then in this instance is to point out the impacts that are mutually exclusive that the other side cannot run away from. So things like even if and this is where like you enter the even ifs, right? So for example, if people uh for example, if you go back to the last example, right? If sorry, yeah. Okay. So you can say on government in the debate about like uh passion versus goal orientedness, you can point out that success is not going to be mutually exclusive on both. It's not mutually exclusive on either side of the debate, because the world is bad. There are hurdles to success like capitalism, your gender, your race, your socioeconomic class. So success is always going to be relative and like not exclusive. What is exclusive in the debate is how you're going to wake up in the morning, if you're going to like yourself and like what you're doing, if you're going to be able to find a sense of fulfillment in the things that you're doing, regardless of whether or not it leads to success. And that is the most mutually exclusive impact that only government can provide. So you break the deadlock, right? Because it's no longer a debate about success, about whether or not passion can give you that success, or whether or not you should be focused on your goals, etc., etc. It's now a debate about whether or not you get fulfillment and how important that fulfillment is to your daily life. So that's how you break that deadlock. The third way is to identify the end goals, because again, um uh uh teams will often have very very similar end goals. People will generally debate for something that is generally very positive, right? So they will generally have the same end goals. What you can do to break the deadlock on that point is to prove how you get the end goal of the other team. So you prove that you're fighting for the same thing, and then you prove that you're going to get that thing, but like in less steps. Like it's easier for you to do that. And the fourth thing is just to weigh. So you can weigh impacts. You can say that, okay, we'll bite the bullet. You can say that people are richer on your side. That's okay. We'll accept that people are richer. We say that that still weighs less over personal contentment at the end of the day. People's ability to feel fulfilled in their lives, people's ability to um find meaning in their jobs, etc., etc. And then you just give structural reasons for why that weighing is true and why you're more important. And that in turn gives you the ability um to debate in a way that's not brute force. Like you don't have to take down entirely the other side. um because generally that is what like high school debaters tend to do. They respond and they respond and they respond, but there is another way to debate, and that is to not to brute force your way into the door, but just to kind of sidestep it and then prove why you're more important. Because it's not always about who can prove likelihood the most. It's also about who can prove importance and centrality to the debate and to the motion. And that is how you win certain clashes. So yes, that is how generally you break deadlocks. Next slide, please. Okay, what to do when the world is ending. So earlier I told you guys um about prepping in around, about knowing about what the clashes are going to be, knowing what to do with certain motion types and certain clashes, because you should have like stock knowledge of debate at this point. Um But unfortunately, you will not always be able to predict your opponent. So there are going to be teams that are not going to run the right cases, or at least not going to run cases that you thought they would run. Sometimes people run cases that are just wrong. Like they're not relevant to the motion, or they don't debate in fair spirit. Sometimes teams will debate will forward arguments that are not wrong, but are just kind of weird to run, especially at opening. So things like that. So you aren't going to always be able to predict how the debate is going to go. And part of it is the beauty of debate, that there's always something new. But also it can be kind of annoying when you've already prepped like a really good case and really good responses, and then it doesn't end up going the way that you expected it to go. So there are four things you do to this. The first is that you explain why your frame is more likely. And this is on cases where you disagree on the frame, right? So, for example, um, in a debate, if we go back to the previous motions on the um South Korean feminists. So it's this house believes that South Korean feminists should advocate for the conscription of women. And you predict that government will characterize South Korean feminism as very distinct from Western feminism, because South Korea is generally a very conservative country. Their laws and their cultures are very different from that of Western countries, etc., etc. So their problems are a little bit different then. And then your opponent makes it about things like abortion rights, or things like the wage gap, um, which are important issues, but it's not the issue that we're debating on. We're debating on the conscription of women, right? The first thing you do is to explain why your frame is more likely. You can prove why structurally South Korean feminists are more likely to care about these things because of how their culture has ingrained in them, the importance of um, military service, or the importance of honor and duty, or generally just why they want to be seen as more equal to men. Um, or you can just explain why their frame is not relevant to the debate. You just say, well, they're not talking about the right things, so automatically we win. But you also have to prove that and spend a little bit time on it. And then once you've explained why your frame is more likely, right? You explain then why you win on either frame. Because oftentimes it's not enough to again just brute force a debate and prove why your frame is more true. Because adjudicators have to also credit, in most instances, they'll have to credit what the other side is saying, regardless of whether or not it's right. So you also have to prove why then you win on either frame. Um, and this is a lot of time this is my favorite thing to do in debates, because it's kind of like a pat yourself on the back moment, because they thought they were gonna win if they say this specific characterization. Well, we still win the man. So the way that you win on either frame is just to not make your case contingent on any one frame. Um, so you can say, for example, in a debate about whether or not governments are good, or about whether or not you should adopt a free market, you shouldn't hinge your case on whether or not governments are good or bad, or whether or not corporations are good or bad, because 90% of the time your opponent is going to contest and say that you're using a convenient frame. What you do is to tell you, oh, even if governments are good, or even if corporations are good, the free market is still going to be bad, because free market people are selfish. They're going to exploit their workers. They're going to um push out small businesses, and that's not contingent on the government being bad or good. So that is how you win on either frame, right? You have to make a case that's going to be true in all instances of the debate, regardless of whether or not the adj buys your setup. So that's partly in prep and partly in round adjustment, where you have to sort of if your PM speech, if your PM as a partner made it sound like your case was very, very specific and very, very targeted. You as a deputy have to do the job of clarifying that we actually don't care about these issues on whether on like governments and corporations. All that you're arguing on is whether or not blah 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 blah. Um, and the third thing you have to do is to prove the centrality of your arguments. So again, sometimes opponents will just run cases that are just wrong or are not relevant to the debate or are just very squirrely or very, very bad. So you have to prove then once you've already taken down like their likelihood because you've already argued your frame is more likely or why you win on either frame, the third thing you have to do is to prove why your arguments are more central to the debate. So the ways that you can do this is to first compare it to the motion. So just read the motion. If the motion is a regrets debate and they're arguing on future impacts, then you just say, well, this is a regrets motion, we have to argue retroactively, and therefore they can't win on the assumption that future impacts are going to happen if they haven't proved what's happened in the past. So things like that. Just generally proving why your arguments are more relevant and why they should be credited more than the arguments of the other person. And then the fourth thing is on burden fulfillment. And this can be about the motion, but it can also be about the kinds of burdens that you set up for yourself as a team. So there are, for example, in rounds, in like decent rounds, teams are going to be able to point out na these are the clashes of the debate or these are the issues that we want to solve, and therefore and they're very, very important. So if we solve these issues, then we win the debate. And in rounds like that, it's very, very easy then to track what you need to do. So all you need to do is to prove why you fulfill the opponent's burden that they've already propped up to be very, very big and very, very important. And if you've proved that burden, you already win it over them on their metrics. This is also a very nice way to win because it's kind of like, I'm better than you at what you said you were going to do. So, for example, if the motion is about if the motion is about, let's say, go back to the motion about the commercialization of social movements, right? Let's say government has propped up their debate to be about social movements not having any buy-in, and therefore that's very, very bad for social change. So the end goal of government is to prove that they get social change. The way that you tackle that as opposition then is to prove why, well, even if it's commercialized and some people opt out, the commercialization makes it more accessible and makes it easier to support. Therefore, we get more buy-in, therefore we get more social change. And that's generally how you adjust to that case, right? So because you were able to prove why you fulfill the burden of social change better, you are able to win on the metric that government has set up for themselves. And that is how you're able to prove to the edge that you're just generally like better. So yeah, that's for in-round adjustment. The first is prove the likelihood of your frame. The second is prove why that actually doesn't matter. Well, it still matters, but like prove why even if you don't buy that, you still win on either frame. The third thing is to prove why your arguments are more central to the debate and therefore more important. And then the fourth thing is to assume the importance of both sides or to assume the importance of the frame that your opponent is trying to posit and then prove why you win it anyway. So that is for in-round adjustment. So now we will do the Q&A. If you guys have any questions, you can either send it in the chat or you can open your mic. So someone asked the question, how do you prove which clash or which impact should be considered? Like in a debate about banning fast food among high school students, government argues health while opposition argues convenience due to economic status. How do I weigh this? Okay, I will send it, by the way, in the chat to everyone so that everyone can see it. Yeah, but I won't tell people who's asked naman. So generally, as a debater, you're going to be able to decide which clash should be considered more. So there are a lot of metrics to this, right? The first is on likelihood. So let's say the clash is about health versus convenience. What is more likely to have direct impacts on kids? Um, is it that, so you can, for example, if you're gov, you can say that, well, there are other things that we can do to make it more convenient or to make it more accessible, but you can never make fast food more healthy, like significantly more healthy, so that it doesn't harm students in the long run. Therefore, convenience loses out because the school can subsidize the school can subsidize food, or we can like lower taxes on it, or we can just generally make sure that there are other options and that fast food can be the last resort, um things like that. So if then their case is about convenience, we've already taken down the importance of convenience because there are other ways to make it convenient. It's not mutually exclusive. Then health has to win because health is irreversible. So that's how you win the clash on government side. You just have to set up a metric. So on in this case, it's like exclusivity of harms, and then win on that metric by and then prove why that metric is important. Um, Usually in that specific order. So say, oh, the harms are irreversible. It's bad because it's irreversible because it means that we are not never going to be able to get that health back. So it's better if like we prioritize health because there are other ways to make it convenient. So yeah. Um Metrics like weighing metrics generally include things like likelihood, so which impact is more likely, um the exclusivity again of impacts, whether or not you can get that on the other side, and therefore that kind of lowers the importance of the opposing case. The centrality to the motion, the magnitude of the impacts, if it's like a really really big harm, like um killing students slowly versus students not having access to snacks, things like that. So those are generally the things that you can use to weigh. And then it's up to you how you utilize those metrics within the debate to make it clear to the judge why you win. Why you win that clash and why that clash is important. So yes. What else? Other questions? How do you integrate sub-clashes within the bigger main clash of the debate? Sorry, I sent it back to the person that sent it. Okay. Okay. How do you integrate sub-clashes within the bigger main clash of the debate? Um, okay. So generally there are like levels to this, right? Because there are sub-clashes that are pretty similar to the main clash that you can just respond to at the same time, or like make it just a smaller issue within your issue. But then there are also sub-clashes that you don't really need to integrate. Um, the way that you can like use this in the round, if there are subclasses, and for example, if you think that that subclash is important, like for example, if you want to win on that subclash, if you think that you win on that subclash and you want to make it the most important part of the debate, I think you just do that through weighing. You just say why that smaller clash is more important, like it has more impact to the debate, and therefore it should weigh over this bigger clash about bigger impacts. because those impacts will inevitably be deadlocked, and therefore we should focus on these smaller, like sort of like trivial issues that are going to actually tip the balance of the debate. If you actually want to integrate them, like I think that one, you look for the parts of the clashes that are similar. So are they both about the same impact? Like, are they both about saving human lives? It's just they do it differently. Is it are they both is one of them a prerequisite to the other happening, and therefore have to be evaluated in the same like um part of the speech? So things like that. I think the way that you can do it, if they are related, if if they tackle the same issue and they just do it differently, you just all that you have to do is determine which method is more likely. So yeah, so which method is more likely to actually solve the issue? Um, and then that is how, and then just weigh it within your speech. If they, if one of them is a prerequisite to the other happening, and you want to expound on that or you want to emphasize it because that's your contribution in the round, do that by saying that this is the main clash of the debate. So let's say the main clash of the debate is saving the lives of the people in island A. But to save the lives of people on island A, we first have to get resources. We have to get international support. And that is why, let's say, CG was so important in this debate because we are the only team to prove how you get those resources in the first place. And that is how, and then you go ahead and prove like why that's a prerequisite. So you say that you can't save lives if you don't have food. You can't save lives if you don't have transportation. So things like that. Um, uh, generally naman, I think that depending on the clashes that you're talking about, it can be pretty intuitive within the debate. It's just a matter of knowing how to organize your speech so that it flows correctly. Um, so yes, that is how you integrate the subclashes. It depends on how close the subclashes are with the main clash. If they're really not close, if they're really, really different, and they just evaluate them at different parts of the speech. That's also okay. Yes. Okay. Do you guys have any other questions? Okay, so I think we can give it like 2 more minutes and then yes. Okay, so I think that there are no additional questions. So with that, I think we can end the lecture. So thank you so much, guys, for coming to DEP-IT. And so, ayan.
All right, thank you so much, Chelsea. Right, so I guess just to summarize the entire event, I hope that everyone or all the participants learned something with the second session of DEPIT, which is primarily about staging the debate. Our first lecture is about contextualization and characterization, and we'd like to thank Nessie for the lecture. Our second lecture as well is about framing and impacting, and we thank KL for giving the lecture as well. And finally, we also thank, of course, Chelsea in terms of reading the debate. So I think before we end, just a few reminders for the participants. Um, First, please don't forget to answer the session feedback form, which is in the Discord channel. But also, please, if you have any remaining questions, please feel free to reach out within the Discord channel. We recently added a new text channel that has or is set up specifically for queries if you have anything related to lecture. The session slides will be published later on, so you can expect that as well. So I think before we end, I just like to kindly request everyone to turn on their cameras for some picture taking, and Cedric will be the one assigned to do that.
Can I be heard?
Cedric? Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. Let me turn on my cam. And everyone else turn on their cam. I hope everyone's having a good evening too. Thank you guys for attending DEP-IT. Really appreciate it from OAD. Okay. Let's wait for the others. Hi guys. All right. Okay. Think maybe we can start. Uh, 3, 2, 1, smile. Isa pa. Okay, isa pa. All right. 3, 2, 1, smile. All right. Thank you guys.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening. See you next session.